1. How does racial and ethnic identity impact equity and opportunity within educational contexts?
First of all, thank you for asking me the questions about racism in higher education. To answer the first question clearly, I want to restate it first. How does racial and ethnic identity impact equity and opportunity within educational context? Well, the whole goal of equity is to create more fair access for students and professionals as well. Because you need to have equitable ways of dealing with your faculty, your classified employees, and your additional personnel as well. So whenever you have one group that is identified as being more important than the other group, then you create a discriminatory practice. And discrimination always not only impacts education, but it impacts every area of the institution, because we're not able to train the students or to really create a work environment that is fair and safe for everyone. You're not able to really create or develop a clear curriculum that each student themselves can really benefit from. So in my final answer to this question, it creates a discriminatory basis and practice that is not healthy for any institution.
2. How can educators model vulnerability when discussing race and racism?
That's a very difficult but fearful question to answer. How can educators model vulnerability when discussing race and racism? I think, quite frankly, when you are vulnerable, you're educating your students, or you are showing your colleagues more humanism. You are sharing many of the barriers that are created in the institution, and what you're doing is just that you're opening others up to share their thoughts and their feelings and their perspectives. So I think one of the things that a positive educator can do is to become vulnerable and to discuss really their working environments, to discuss their concerns, to discuss their, I would say, unfair practices, intentional or unintentional. And I think that will help to open up more discussion and to make the institution a better place for employment. And especially, it helps the institution to have a more, I would say, safe space where students can learn.
3. What role does transparency play in addressing racism in higher education?
What role does transparency play in addressing racism in higher education? It plays a critical component, because if you're not honest, you can't address anything. You have to be transparent even when it makes individuals uncomfortable. The majority of my mega instructional career in higher education has all been based on honesty and transparency. Many may not like it, but in order to improve and make any change, you have to really be honest about what is happening at the institution. Many times institutions are guilty of having a lot of things written down in the paper, but they don't answer or they don't address any of the concerns that they have written in a plan or mission statement at all. So what role does transparency play in addressing racism in higher education? You cannot address racism in higher education if you're not honest.
4. How can higher education institutions, HAES, understand and address systemic racism?
One of the ways that higher education can address systemic racism. Let me restate the question again. How can higher education institutions understand and address systemic racism? It's one, by being transparent and open. It's by creating groups to really come together to not only dialogue about matters, but to really make actionable changes and institute real changes within the institution. In order for us to address systemic racism, we have to really see where the foundation of the racism develops. I think what happens over the time is just that institutions have so many committees and they have so many missions that sometimes the real bottom line reality of systemic racism gets lost. But systemic racism is found many times in almost every aspect of life, and the institution have to accept the fact that it is part of society and it holds many of these practices regardless of how it does not want to admit it or address it. So one of the ways that we can understand it is to admit and to be honest. And as we do that, actually began to create plans and make changes, but put funding and actionable plans, hire personnel to address many of these matters. And hopefully from doing some of those things, our lives will improve.
5. What actions can individuals working in academia take to counteract institutional racism?
5. What actions can individuals working in academia take to counteract institutional racism? If you are a faculty professional, you can talk to your students about it. You can call out your students when practices are not positive. You can address these matters with your administrators and really be relentless to help make changes for the students, but also for professionals. When it comes to many of the classified workers, you can talk to many of them, and especially those classified workers who've been in institutions for years and never seem to be treated fairly. You can take the time to understand that sometimes things are racial and intentionally racist, and sometimes things are racially charged. But you can really be honest and address many of the matters that are around all of the institutions with the hope to making the institution look like a well-balanced world. Because the college is very much like a fine, faith-based center minus theology.